Thank you, Rachel. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Way Forward Workshop Leader Lunch Break. It was several months ago when at the Cleveland Leadership Center, we began discussing how we were going to recognize Juneteenth. And we decided that we would do a short, but hopefully powerful history on the Black experience in America. When we asked who would be the best person to kick this off, the answer was Dr. Regennia Williams, because she is the distinguished scholar of African American history and culture at the Western Reserve Historical Society. In addition to doing that important work, she's also the executive director and resident scholar for the RASHAD Center, and that stands for the Center for the Study of Religion and Spirituality in the History of Africa and the Diaspora, and she serves as editor-in-chief for the Journal of Traditions and Beliefs, the biennial scholarly journal of RASHAD. She is a prolific writer and lecturer and has presented in Canada, Nigeria, South Africa, China, and France, and she boasts an extensive and exhaustive list of scholarly publications studying the African American journey and experience. She previously taught at Montgomery College and the University of the District of Columbia. She holds several bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, as well as a PhD in history from Case Western Reserve University. She's a Fulbright recipient, has more faculty and teaching awards than I have time to list right now. And my favorite, she has been recognized as a woman who makes a difference. When I reached out to Dr. Williams and invited her to speak, I shared with her that we wanted to cover African American history. And her response was, "You want to do 200 years of African American history in less than an hour?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "You know, that's more than a full course. And that is how I teach it." And I said, "Yes." And she said, "I will do it without reservation." So we are very pleased to kick off this series and welcome Dr. Williams.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I want to begin by saying special thanks to several people. So I'm going to open up the PowerPoint presentation for today's discussion and move quickly to my acknowledgements page. First and foremost, I thank my colleague, Dr. John Grabowski at the Western Reserve Historical Society. And this is a special moment in my life. 20 years ago, Dr. Grabowski was on my dissertation committee, and that was a journey. Anybody who's written a dissertation knows what a challenging journey that could be. But now I'm so pleased to say that this is my 20th anniversary year of the successful defense of the dissertation and taking that walk across the stage at Case Western Reserve University. And that my former committee member is now my colleague. I like this relationship much better. So thank you certainly to John Grabowski for referring the Leadership Center to me. I will do my best. Thank you, Marianne and Rachel, for your support in getting things prepared for this special moment in our history. And I shared a little bit of my history with leadership here in the city of Cleveland by suggesting that Margot James Copeland was someone that I had the opportunity to work with when I was on that journey toward the PhD. And she was working with the Urban League of Greater Cleveland. And when I think about all that Margot was doing at that time, and in the years before and after that part-time position with the Urban League, my goodness, it was the Junior League, it was Leadership Cleveland, it was the Greater Cleveland Roundtable, and then it became Key Bank, but she just has done so much incredible work. And so she's a hero for me. And I think my Angela would probably say she's a shero. I don't even know if Margot still remembers my name, but I remember everything that she did to enrich the lives of leaders and aspiring leaders in this community. And I just wanted to acknowledge her as we move through this outline. And last but not least, another Hamptonian. Margot was proud of the fact, maybe still is, that she graduated from Hampton University in Virginia, just as my mentor and former teacher, A. Grace Lee Mims, did. about, oh my goodness, for Grace, it would have been about 1952. But between the two of them, I actually got some backbone and some courage, and I'm able to speak my mind, in settings such as this. And again, I give them credit for them, along with my parents, for encouraging me to find my voice and speak my mind. So again, just wanted to acknowledge them at the outset. Um, I do want to give a quick overview of the 200 plus years of Cleveland history, and it'll be very quick because I want to get to the fourth bullet point on this list. That will be the focus actually of my presentation, and hopefully our brief discussion following that presentation. Race, class, and gender. Those are major themes that I explored throughout my graduate school days and also throughout the many years of my teaching at Cleveland State University, at Cuyahoga Community College, and when I left Cleveland for just a little while in the Maryland and DC area. And they continue to inform the work that I do today, especially as it relates to the oral history research. But one thing that I've noticed in looking through some of the major monographs associated with Cleveland's history is that sometimes the scholars have a tendency to focus on the work of representative men and women in Black Cleveland's history. And there's nothing wrong with that, except that it's not just about the leaders, it's also about the followers and those unsung heroes who make up the masses who are engaged in those movements, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, to name two, especially in 20th century Cleveland history. But what I'd like to consider in this historical moment, having just celebrated the first Juneteenth, where we had the declaration of it being a federal holiday, and now moving into what might very well be a long, hot summer with the ongoing protests associated with the Black Lives Matter movement, I'd like to focus on this idea of intersectionality, where we're not just looking at someone who is a Black woman or a Black man or an upper class Black man or a lower class Black woman, but how do all of these different factors intersect to shape the experiences of Black people in general here in the city of Cleveland? So I want to include a discussion of some definitions in just a moment. But first to say, here's where I'm borrowing some of my inspiration for today's presentation. The Black Americans in Cleveland book, published in the 1970s by Russell Davis, has earned, I think, for a lot of students of history, a permanent place on their bookshelves, in their libraries, both at home and at work. And so I wanted to let you know where I got the title from for this particular presentation. But then for the subtitle, again, looking at intersectionality and the lives of Black women, especially, this is the title that I had in mind. We specialize in the wholly impossible. A reader in Black women's history. One of the people responsible for that edited volume is Darlene Clark Hine, not quite a Clevelander, but a native of Chicago, Illinois, who earned her PhD at Kent State University. And that book was around in the 1990s when I was still a graduate student at Case. And again, there's lots of wonderful information there to say that women were not silent, although they were often silenced by those individuals who taught a history that often excluded the voices of Black women in particular and other women in a very general way. But again, Black Americans in Cleveland, and listening to and learning lessons from those individuals who specialize in the wholly impossible, Black women. So in looking at the work of these women, I want to focus on this idea of transformational leadership in Cleveland, circa the centenary celebration for the city of Cleveland. That would have been 1896 to 1941, the end of the interwar period, and the year in which we have America entering the second global conflict of the 20th century. So here is the definition of transformational leadership that I'm working with. And this is one that helped to inspire my most recent publication, which focused on leadership for change in South Africa and with university students who were involved in an undergraduate exchange program, including some of my students at Cleveland State University. And so I'm quoting Dr. Simone Flynn, who said in 2019, transformational leaders refers to leaders who look beyond their own interests to act for the good of the organization. Transformational leaders tend to share similar traits, characteristics, and behaviors. For example, transformational leaders exhibit vision, staff development, supportive leadership, empowerment, innovative thinking, and charisma. Transformational leaders give their followers a cogent and inspiring vision of the future, treat them as individuals and encourage their development, give them encouragement and recognition, promote trust and cooperation among them, help them develop novel approaches to old problems, and instill in them pride and respect for one another and for their work, close quote. So again, in looking at transformational leadership, I began by contrasting that, as Dr. Flynn did, with transactional leadership. And maybe in a nutshell, we can say the transformational leaderships aren't just in this for the money. You know, what's in it for me? What will I get out of whatever it is that you're asking me to do? But again, putting their own interest aside, but thinking about the good of the organization. And I would expand that to say the good of the surrounding community or the wider society. Those are the kinds of people that I'd like to talk about briefly in today's presentation on the history of Blacks in the city of Cleveland. Now, since I said I was going to consider ideas from 200 years of history, I just want to talk about the progressive ideas that have helped to shape Ohio's history in a very general way, and certainly impacted the policies that were shaped here on America's North Coast. And so I look back to 1787, the year in which we have the framing of the Constitution. There's another very important policy that comes into being as well. And those policies and the ideas associated with it are embodied in the Northwest Ordinance. And I like to say it includes some revolutionary rhetoric, because among other things, the ordinance suggests that neither slavery nor involuntary servitude will exist in the Northwest Territory or any of the states carved out of it. That's pretty progressive for 1787, just a few years after the end of the Revolutionary War, because America emerges from that war as a slave-holding society. The framers of the Northwest Ordinance say, not in this part of the United States of America. Well, they'd have to struggle, to keep Ohio from becoming a slave state when it was about to attain statehood in 1803, but that was a victory that Ohio legislators could claim for themselves by 1803. Now, in the in-between time, if we can use that phrase, the time between the 1787 Northwest Ordinance and the framing of the Constitution, there is an important freedom fighter who was born in Virginia, the largest slave state, in 1795, and it's John Malvin. He's one of those representative men who gets a lot of attention because he wrote his autobiography. And so his story is one that Clevelanders and those who teach the history of Cleveland like to recall. And that book is among the materials in the archives of the Western Reserve Historical Society. But Cleveland itself is founded in 1796. Again, just a few years before Ohio enters the Union and starts its frontier history here just above the Ohio River, and then to the north, just below the lake known as Erie. Now, there are major decades. The Underground Railroad certainly is going to have some major stops here in the city of Cleveland, thanks to people like John Malvin. Even though Cleveland's not a slave state, it's not necessarily one that is hospitable for African Americans who are escaping from slavery in areas further south. But there are people like John Malvin who will help those people along the Underground Railroad make their way to Canada and places where they might enjoy, those escaping fugitives, a greater measure of freedom. And there are other names, other representative people, including Charles Chestnut, great Negro writer, and a native of the city of Cleveland, and also Booker T. Washington, born in the 1850s 1950s, their ideas would shape certainly the ideas of those individuals who are writing here on America's North Coast, especially those men and women of color. And for this Wells, she is one of those individuals who will help to inspire some of the activist organizations led by women here in the city of Cleveland, and that's none other than Ida Bell Wells Barnett, born in the 1860s in the state of Mississippi. And the point that I'm making here by including these names on the timeline is that Cleveland is marching forward. And again, we're focusing on a way forward beyond this Black Lives Matter moment, but a way forward when so much of our public dialogue is associated with critical race theory. There are some things in addition to race that shape the thinking of women like Wells, even though they wouldn't have referred to it as intersectionality in the 19th century. So even as Malvin is leaving the scene, we have people like Booker Taliaferro Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois focusing on the education of Black people, most of them concentrated in the South, but growing numbers of them associated with free states and the Western territories and ultimately Western states like California, areas outside of the former slave South. And then too, I know there's probably more than a few attorneys on the list. I saw the name of one that I recognize, and that's Helen Forbes Fields, but I think there are others as well. There are Supreme Court cases that also inform what's happening on the ground as far as activism is concerned here in the city of Cleveland. And with the ruling in the Plessy v. Ferguson case in the 1890s, there are many people who believe that they've been given the green light to go ahead and implement segregationist policies where they had not formally existed. And so it's a turbulent era. One historian would suggest that it's the nadir as far as African-American history is concerned. It's a low point. People celebrate freedom at that first Juneteenth in Galveston, Texas in 1866. But Black people are really still struggling through the 1890s and the early decades of the 20th century to make real on the promise of freedom that was extended to them at the end of the Civil War in 1865. There are some signs of hope, I'd have to say, though, when I look at this timeline that focuses on Clevelanders and then those at the national level who have ties to the state of Ohio and also to the ongoing civil rights movement. So the Hughes here is James Mercer Langston Hughes. And for a time, he called Cleveland home when he was a student at Central High School. And the fact that he is a favorite writer for W.E.B. Du Bois, who published The Souls of Black Folk in 1903, doesn't hurt his prospects as a writer coming of age in the 1920s during the Harlem Renaissance. So again, there's a renaissance in arts and letters, and people with ties to Cleveland are part of that as well, as far as Black history is concerned. Now, we call this the Great War that the United States is involved in. It continues through 1919. In hindsight, we would call it World War I. There was hope that this would be the world that the war that would make the world safe for democracy, and that when that war was over in 1919, there would never be another like it. Unfortunately, we were wrong, but there was great optimism in the 1920s. I think the establishment of Karamu House, again, coming into its own in that Negro Renaissance of the 1920s, formed in 1915, but again, gaining popularity as a settlement house that will use the arts to uplift and transform individuals in the surrounding community, many of them the children of immigrants. Others of them were migrants from other parts of the United States where Blacks had earlier been concentrated, but the Great Black Migration and this sort of growing cultural nationalism helps to fuel that Negro Renaissance that would help to launch the careers of people like Langston Hughes, and also, as I mentioned here, Zora Neale Hurston, who is writing How It Feels to Be Colored Me and celebrating the fact that she's not tragically colored. Even with the stock market crash, as we get close to the end of this particular segment of the timeline, I'd have to say that Clevelanders were cautiously optimistic when Mary Brown Martin, the first person of color, a Negro woman, was elected, not appointed, to the school board. The franchise, while it was still being denied to Black people in the American South, was something that those individuals who had migrated to northern cities like Cleveland could exercise, even if they struggled against other social and economic challenges here on America's North Coast. And again, stock market crash for a lot of us signals the onset of the Great Depression in the 1930s, but also it's an era in which we get the New Deal and the age of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and unfortunately, the end of this interwar period with America's official entry into World War II in 1941, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor. But Mary Brown Martin, again, significantly here in Cleveland, is among the New Dealers who will work with her colleagues on the school board to try to transform the existing social order, if not revolutionize it, and especially do that in such a way that it would benefit poor and working class Black students here in the city of Cleveland. So, intersectionality. We're talking about gender primarily and race. When we look at the work of Mary Brown Martin, although she's often celebrated as being the first Negro, she is also a woman. And intersectionality suggests that she will experience racism in ways that differ from the experiences of Black men in the city of Cleveland, like Langston Hughes and others. And so we look to the scholarship of professor and attorney Kimberly Crenshaw, who's a faculty member at Columbia University and UCLA and the law schools there. But she gives us this term intersectionality, and people are still grappling with it when they try to make sense out of critical race theory in 2021. But she said these days, and I'm quoting a Time Magazine article from 2020, February of 2020, Black History Month. She says, these days, I start with what it's not, because there has been distortion. It's not identity politics on steroids when we talk about the importance of intersectionality. It's not a mechanism to turn white men into the new pariahs. It's basically a lens, a prism for seeing the way in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. We tend to talk about race inequality as separate from inequality based on gender, class, sexuality, or immigrant status. What's often missing is how some people are subject to all of these, and the experience is not just the sum of its parts. So again, this is Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who has some ties to Ohio, although not Cleveland, but she is still going strong as an educator and a prolific writer, born in Ohio in 1959, based on the sources that I've consulted. So then, when we talk about people like Mary B. Martin, and again, I've mentioned her a little earlier and want to say a little bit more about her now from a scripted piece that I have in front of me, but we focus primarily on race women and reform in the city of Cleveland and the intersectionality associated with being a Black woman in an elected position here on the school board. Mary B. Martin, as I suggest here, was born in 1877, the official end of the Reconstruction era in American history, and she lives through 1939, dying of natural causes here in the city of Cleveland, just after she had been reelected to the school board. So we want to spend a little time there talking about this idea of a race woman. And I would have to say race men and race women are defined in this way. And some of the most representative among them would be William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, who was the first African-American to earn a PhD from Harvard University. That's in the 1890s, excuse me. And then Booker T. Washington, born a slave in what was then Virginia around 1856, would go on to be the founding principal of Tuskegee Institute and Normal School, and later Tuskegee University in Alabama. These race men and their female colleagues, including Ida B. Wells Barnett, a suffragette, and also someone who is an educator and a journalist, and Mary Brown Martin. Race is central to the work that they do in their daily lives, although they don't try to tease out gender issues, but race is there first and foremost, shaping their careers, if you will, as educators and authors, and also shaping their lives here in the city of Cleveland, which would have Black people living in almost every ward in the city as early as 1910. But by 1930, there's a great concentration of Black people. Great not as in excellent, but great as in large. There are tens of thousands of Black people who are concentrated in the Cedar Central community, a community that historian Kenneth Cusmer describes as a ghetto in his very popular history of Cleveland from the late 19th through the first 3 decades of the 20th century. A ghetto takes shape. But we're going to talk about intersectionality and what it means to be this Black elected official if you are Mary B. Martin in the era of the Great Depression. And I would like to start this excerpt from a published piece by looking at this passage. Mary Brown Martin, I write, in Reading, Writing, and Racial Uplift, Education and Reform in Cleveland, Ohio, made history on Monday, January 6, 1930. At the regular meeting of the Cleveland Board of Education, she took the oath of office and became the first African-American member of the board. She was assigned to the Finance Committee and the Committee on Housing and Supplies. Immediately, she was faced with the reality of the Great Depression's negative impact on school fortunes, dwindling school finances, and a physical plant that could not supply adequate housing for the thousands of students in need of classroom space. And that was just the tip of the iceberg. The challenges facing Martin as the only African-American member of the school board were further complicated by the fact that the African-American community had its own special concerns. The African-American community had members in organizations like the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, also known as the NAACP, and they had aggressively campaigned for Martin's election to the board in 1929, believing that the presence of at least one African-American representative member on the school board would result in the community's concerns being addressed. Needless to say, Mary Brown Martin had her work cut out for her. Now, I should say, close quote, in talking about the role of the NAACP and working with Mary Brown Martin, Black people were still very much in the minority in the city of Cleveland. So she was elected because of the Republican machine, if I can say it that way. And there were individuals who endorsed her candidacy and encouraged non-Black people to vote for her. And for example, when she was reelected to the board, the vote was actually 20,000 people for Martin, 20,000 people more than the total Black population in the city of Cleveland. So Mary B. Martin couldn't have a successful career on the school board, focusing only on the plight of Black children in the schools, even if that was something that the NAACP wanted her to do. So soon after she took that oath of office in 1930, interestingly enough, she says some people, and I'm paraphrasing, in the city are confused. They seem to think that I am here to represent the interests of colored people only. Nothing, she would suggest, could be further from the truth. I am here, she'd say, and this is a direct quote, to represent all classes of people. Not necessarily what the NAACP wanted to hear, although the NAACP, as I'm sure most of you know, was founded primarily by radical white people when it was established in New York. But the focus was on colored people and the denial of constitutional rights, political rights, social and economic rights in this country. But it's largely a citizenship organization. They look at the promise of the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, and then look at and focus on those ways in which Blacks are being denied certain opportunities. For Mary B. Martin, who is active in the NAACP, along with her attorney husband, Alexander Martin, one of the things that will put Black people on the path to full citizenship is quality education. And it's interesting to listen to and read some of the things that people like Martin are writing in the 1920s and 30s. There's almost this blind faith in education to transform or revolutionize the existing social order. But again, that's where the NAACP was. That's where Mary B. Martin was. And I should say she was not alone. One of the other groups that I need to mention at this point in time is the National Association of Colored Women. That group was formed in 1896, and their motto was lifting as we climb. And there were women's groups here, notably at the Mount Zion Congregational Church, and an African-American congregation that's now has a home in the University Circle community, almost across the street from the Western Reserve Historical Society. But again, this idea of lifting as we climb also points to the importance of intersectionality. One of the reasons that these leaders in the National Association of Colored Women and the sister club women here in the city of Cleveland, the reason that they could help, the reason that they had time to go to meetings, the reason that they had time to protest the denial of the franchise to women in general and Black women in particular was because they had help. You know, they were upper class, many of them, or upper middle class women of color. And so again, when they suggest that they want to lift the downtrodden people of color in the United States, especially here in the state of Ohio and in those clubs in the city of Cleveland, they didn't necessarily want to lose the advantages that they enjoyed because they were members of an upper socioeconomic group in the society. So again, not in favor of social leveling, but lifting up those people who are the lowest down as far as the socioeconomic status are concerned. And so there's a politics of respectability that people like Mary B. Martin and others would be concerned about, getting those Southern migrants, for example, to dress properly, to use the King's English, to pursue education, to let go of their country ways. That was something that Martin and others were concerned about. And I don't know that that's necessarily a negative, at least not the way I'm trying to describe it today, but it was reality. Black life in America was very complicated. There is no monolithic kind of history that would accurately describe the experiences of all Black people in the city of Cleveland. And I will suggest that the school teacher, Mary B. Martin, if she had been one of the functionally illiterate thousands of migrants who came to the city of Cleveland in the early decades of the 20th century, it's very unlikely that she would have been elected to the school board. But that great migration is important. There's another person who is watching Mary B. Martin's activities in this era, one of those representative people who celebrates the fact that she secures that victory and is elected to the school board in 1929. His name is Charles Waddell Chestnut. And I wanted to talk a little bit about him because his papers, like Mary B. Martin's scrapbook and other documents for her family history, also available at the Western Reserve Historical Society. And in 1923, we have Charles Chestnut, this great Negro novelist, right? He's celebrated as at the turn of the 20th century in the 1920s, still speaking out about racial isolation in the schools in the city of Cleveland. And one of the things that he and other members of the NAACP will make note of is the fact that many African-American students are being steered to a number of ghetto schools. And for them, it's the Outhwaite School, the Longwood School, and then there are segregationist policies that are pushing Central High School, to become a majority Black school. More than 80% of Black school-age children going to one of those 3 schools in the city of Cleveland. And that's as a result of deliberately steering them in that direction, refusing to allow them to transfer out of the school. It's in this period in which we see the election of Mary Brown Martin that I'd have to say the seeds are sown for what will develop as a dual school system in the second half of the 20th century, and what would be challenged again by the NAACP successfully in getting a remedial order to suggest that separate and unequal education is unacceptable here in the city of Cleveland. It's worth noting that ruling comes in the 1970s, but Martin and other members of the NAACP had been fighting for that very just cause, as they saw it, as early as the 1930s. And so then what can we say? We know how Mary B. Martin's term started, but she was also reelected to a second term. And at the start of 1937, there were 98,000 employable persons unemployed in Cuyahoga County. And so it's a 50% decrease from the peak figure of 199,000 4 years earlier at the beginning of her term in office, but still this is very much the era of the Great Depression. The New Deal, however, is making a difference in the lives of the children in the public schools. And it's because Mary Brown Martin and other members on the board are able to use federal funding to help improve the physical plant and create jobs as well for Black and white men, in particular in building trades. And so again, that was something I think we can point to as a sign of success, something that she certainly worked very hard to secure as a member of the board, and something that is documented in the meeting minutes for the Cleveland Board of Education. But there are other things that disappoint Black people in this era of Mary Brown Martin. One of them being that in 1937, the school board is still at the center of this heated controversy about racial isolation in the schools. There's a Call and Post article, for example. The Call and Post, of course, being one of the oldest Black newspapers here in the city of Cleveland. And the article alleges that too many students were enrolled at Longwood and the Outhwaite schools, that they had become, in effect, permanent dumping grounds for not only the average, but also the mentally deficient and slow learning students, close quote. And to the dismay of African-American parents, both institutions were located in the expanding ghetto in the greater Cedar Central area. That was the focus for that great monograph written by the late Dr. Kenneth Cusmer, who passed away in December of 2020. But the official reason given for these segregated schools and this obligation on the part of the schools to provide individual differences for children. Well, what does that mean? Well, there was a tracking system. I think it's safe to say, and many of the children of the migrants from places like Alabama and Mississippi ended up in these schools. And so there is a report that the superintendent's office publishes, and it suggests, among other things, socially, these children they were intended to make handicapped children acceptable and useful members of the community in which they live, and to train them to become law-abiding citizens. So it's more a trade school, industrial education that these students are receiving, as opposed to a college preparatory program that would allow them to pursue additional education at the post-secondary level. The superintendent would also say, in response to criticism from the NAACP, they were designed to develop self-respect and self-reliance, to enable the children to employ their leisure with as much pleasure and profit to himself, with his gendered language, as a normal individual might expect, close quote. So again, we have something happening here in this era where the superintendent and other people in the society are blaming the victims of those segregated schools in the American South, who end up leaving the South because of the racism, because of the extra legal activities engaged in by the members of the Ku Klux Klan and other organizations in the South that made life difficult for Black people, especially in those rural environments where high schools did not exist for many Black students until well into the 20th century. So Mary Brown Martin, facing that kind of criticism that came in the wake of those segregated schools getting the green light, decided not to run for re-election in 1937. And the NAACP was pleased because they weren't supporting her anyway. However, she did run for re-election in 1939. So even though those special activity schools got the okay and Black people were not pleased with that, Mary B. Martin had really widespread support in white ethnic communities here in the city of Cleveland. And I talked about the fact that she received more than 20,000 votes, more than the entire Black population. But in conclusion, in looking at this race woman and her efforts to reform education for Black children in the city of Cleveland, I think we should say that by 1937, Martin was obviously disappointed in the leadership of the civil rights organization, the NAACP, that she had helped launch in strengthening the branch that was established here in the city of Cleveland. But in her 8 years on the school board, she and others were able to secure certain victories to improve the quality of education, even that Black students were receiving in those segregated schools. And so it's sort of mixed results, I think we'd have to say, in looking at the impact of her role and a time spent on the school board, not just focusing on race, but again, looking at the needs of all classes of students in the society. But upon her death, and this was a brain aneurysm in 1939, the NAACP and also those editorial writers for the Call and Post, this Black newspaper, began to be less critical and perhaps more sympathetic to her struggle. Thank you. And the Call and Post wrote, for example, Mrs. Martin exemplified Negro motherhood. Again, not just race, but also womanhood matters here, and typified the new awakening of our women to public service. While we disagreed much and often with Mrs. Martin on her politics, at no time did we ever question her sincerity. She was a woman of strong convictions, and once taking a position was immovable, close quote. And so if I can move quickly to this conclusion. As far as intersectionality is concerned, and maybe there'll be other questions before we wrap things up around 1 o'clock, I wanted to end with this quote by Audre Lorde. And again, looking at intersectionality and women and politics and race and class and gender and how they all intersect in the life of Mary Brown Martin, I think we'd have to agree with the late poet Audre Lorde that as far as intersectionality is concerned, it's complicated. Audre Lorde was a self-described Black lesbian mother poet and dedicated both her life and her creative talent to confronting and addressing injustices of racism, sexism, and classism. So what we're hearing today about intersectionality and critical race theory is something that people have been talking about for decades. It's getting a lot more attention now in Cleveland and in other urban areas, especially where there have been so many protests of late. But I would encourage people who are interested in this topic to look certainly to the New York Times. They say, you know, that's all the news that's fit to print. Well, we'll see what the people from the Plain Dealer have to say about that, what's left of the Plain Dealer. Ohio writers are concerned about critical race theory too, but I love what Audre Lorde said here. Women are powerful and dangerous. So there's an intersectionality for you if ever we needed one. And that's why I think in going forward in my research, although I was quoting from a publication that was based largely on a dissertation I wrote 20 years ago, I think I'm going to have to view the activities of Black women in Cleveland, not just through the lens of race, as I was doing 20 years ago, but to consider this long history of intersectionality and how various characteristics of injustice in this society help to shape the lives of women, especially here in the city of Cleveland. And I think I should close with that, but perhaps not before I say there's a list of suggested readings. I sent this PowerPoint outline to Rachel, and I'm sure that she will share it with other people if they are interested. But I thank you certainly for your attention. I'm going to stop talking and stop sharing the screen and see if there are things that that we can discuss in the closing 10, 12, 15 minutes of today's session together. I'll stop sharing right now.
Great, Dr. Williams, thank you so much. And we have had a few questions come in.
Okay.
Can you speak a little bit more about how the Great Migration affected Cleveland during that time?
Sure. The migration gets a lot of attention, and a wonderful book that isn't on the bibliography, but I would be remiss if I didn't say the title, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, is a beautiful narrative history that talks about the impact of the Great Migration. And certainly there's material related to the city of Cleveland. So I will say this. By the first decade of the 20th century, Black Clevelanders were less than 2% of the population. But by let's go with the 1960s, they were about 33% of the population when Carl Burton Stokes decided that he wanted to be the first Black to be elected mayor of a major city in American history. So again, from 2% to 33%, some of that perhaps we can attribute to natural increase in the population. A lot of it we have to attribute to the impact of the Great Black Migration. And there were two major waves, both of them during the time of war, peak periods of migration. But World War I, we see the first major peak. And then by census year 1920, it's the first time that we have more Black people living in urban areas than in rural areas where they had been concentrated as a result of the agrarian society that came into being during the era of legal slavery in the American South. But also another peak period of migration in the era of World War II. And again, not only are they being pushed off the land in the South because technology is changing the way that farming is carried out in the South. You don't need as many hands thanks to International Harvester and other companies manufacturing these huge pieces of farm equipment. They're forced out of the rural communities. One historian would say there's a movement from field to factory. And during the war industry, if I can say that, there are lots of Black people and women too, significantly, who will find better paying jobs in the war industries, especially during World War II. So the impact is there. Cleveland is not a majority Black city right now. Cedar Central is still very, very Black, but in being transformed, I think certainly due in part to what the Cleveland Clinic is doing, right? In the nearby community. Maybe some people will say more University Circle than Cedar Central, but Cleveland Clinic is coming this way, for people who live off Cedar Avenue. But also significantly, Black people are building new homes off Cedar Avenue, the lower end of Cedar in the 73rd Street, 76th Street, where Charles Chestnut was living in the late 19th century. That house that Chestnut lived in razed, but new homes being built on those vacant lots. So again, that's all a legacy of the Great Black Migration. Again, because of redlining, Black people didn't have the options necessarily of living outside of the central community. So those who came by the tens of thousands that would ultimately end up being 33% or so of the population when Stokes ran for mayor in 1967, they ended up on the East Side. So that's one of the greatest impacts and visible impacts of the Great Black Migration. Thank you.
So as you look at the second half of the 20th century and more recent history in Cleveland, how would you describe the impact that the Black politicians in our city have had?
Well, I think it's been incredible. And certainly having one Black person in office, or even several on city council, has not solved all of the challenges or addressed all of the concerns facing Black people. But certainly, if we look at what's happening in Glenville, if we look at the east side of the city of Cleveland and what's happening with Black Clevelanders from the 1960s going forward, we consider the work of city councilmen and then eventually city council president, Attorney George Forbes, and individuals like the preacher turned politician, or maybe he was a politician all along, but the Reverend Dr. Emmett Theophilus Cavanis in Glenville, and also for Leo Jackson. Those are councilmen who were able to bring resources into the predominantly Black community, and especially into the historic Glenville community. When I say, however, that a few elected representatives weren't able to solve all the problems, we have only to look at what's happening in Glenville in 1968 in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the shootout in Glenville that had a lot to do with feelings about police corruption and Black nationalism and self-defense. And not the nonviolence that Dr. King had preached, but the violence that some people came to believe was necessary for Black people to preserve their lives. So certainly Black male leadership, Black female leadership on the city council, Phyllis Cleveland, if we're talking about what's happening in the Cedar community, I know she made a positive difference, millions of dollars coming into that community for development. Not just for housing, but also for jobs. Absolutely, Stephanie Tubbs Jones made a difference, not only on the local level, but also the national level when she was elected to Congress. But I think when we talk about intersectionality and all of the issues that people are grappling with now, I think Mary B. Martin and Charles Chestnut and some of the other members of the NAACP were correct when they decided that they needed to reach across the color line, if I can use that term, and form partnerships with other people who are not African American. Blacks are still in the minority in this country, just under 10%, and that Hispanics now outnumber Black Americans. Hispanic is not a race, but still language barriers exist in the society. Some Hispanics are Black. And so we can't just look at race anymore. And I think it's Black politicians and also Latina elected officials who are in 2021 calling attention to those various concerns of people who are Black and Latina, and also people who have immigrant status or new Americans, new citizens, but people of color continue to make a difference.
So do you think that there are potentially some important lessons that can be learned from Cleveland, the Western Reserve, eventually much of Northeastern Ohio, becoming somewhat of a hotbed of reform, abolitionism in the 19th century, that could inform the current movement to combat racial injustice?
I absolutely believe that there are lessons that we can learn from the past. And I'm biased, right? Because I do history. But I wouldn't have dedicated my adult life to the study and teaching of history if I didn't believe that there were lessons that we can learn. And so again, looking in the case of Mary Brown Martin, right? This Black woman who tried so hard to please so many people and finally just threw up her hands and said, look, the NAACP didn't support me before very much. For the second time I was elected, I don't care if they're not going to support me in 1939. But what I also know in reading some of the letters, and it's not a lot of correspondence in her collection at the Western Reserve Historical Society. It's a scrapbook. And a lot of those pages are covered with sympathy cards that were received by the family when she died in 1939. But, there's a letter that she wrote to another interesting member in Black women's circles. Her name was Lethea Fleming. And by that time, both of them were members of the Baha'i community, which is not a historically Black religious community. Right? The Baha'is believe that, we are one as a people. And again, when you talk about cultivating friendly relations with other people, to use Booker T. Washington's language, and also finding allies and social justice causes, I think the Baha'is, even in the 1930s, realized that you couldn't continue necessarily to play the race card, and hope to secure victory over the social injustices that people were grappling with, because poor whites and immigrants from the wrong part of Europe, non-English speaking, when I use the quotes in the wrong part of Europe, who were non-Protestant, if they were Christians, or individuals who were Jewish, they also had their struggles in this community. And Mary Brown Martin was able to secure a lot of victories in establishing those allies. So I think that's a smart way to work. If you're looked upon as being a minority, to show that you can find common ground with other people. And I see that in the story of Mary Brown Martin, other members of the NAACP, including Charles Chestnut here in the city of Cleveland. He lived through 1932. Yes, there's a role for those interracial organizations in Pride Month. I have to say that we have a lot of work to do in Black America when it comes to joining forces with individuals in the LGBTQ community to look at intersectionality in a very serious way, not in all churches, but certainly in a lot of Black churches that have been reluctant to do that. And I say that always giving respect to Black church leaders for the important role of the church during the modern civil rights era. But for a lot of people, that era ended in 1968. And Dr. King has been gone since April 4th of 1968 when he was assassinated. It's not just about race anymore. And I think it's our brothers and sisters in the LGBT, I've talked too much and now my tongue is talking, LGBTQ community who can help us to understand that, all right? And there's a Pride program at the Western Reserve Historical Society tomorrow evening. And if you want to know what WRHS and its allies are doing to help reflect the history of that community here in the city of Cleveland, I would invite you to join us at the Historical Society tomorrow evening. Thanks for the question.
Dr. Williams, I think we have come up very quickly on our time, and we thank you for all that you have shared with us and your energy and your passion. And we encourage everyone on our call today to follow up and continue the learning. We covered a lot of time in a very short amount of time, and there's so much more to know. And as Dr. Williams said, we will be sharing the slides afterwards so that you can continue your journey in learning about Black history in Cleveland. With that, I'm going to turn it to Mary Ann.
Thank you, Rachel. And Dr. Williams, thank you. I cannot even begin to imagine the amount of time you invested in distilling all that you know into the 45 minutes that we can find you to. So thank you so very much. And as you know, next week we will be featuring Dr. John Grabowski, your colleague, your mentor, your dissertation advisor, who will continue our journey under better understanding the history of African Americans in our greater Cleveland community. I hope that you all have a fabulous week, and we look forward to seeing you next Wednesday. Be safe.
Thank you. Take care.